32. 32 men who never saw it coming. Each one an expert. Each one trained to kill from a distance. And all 32 of them fell to a single sergeant who understood one terrifying truth. The most dangerous weapon in war is not the rifle, the grenade, or the blade. It is deception. And Sergeant Alfred Clive Hume was about to use it in a way that would haunt military strategists for decades to come. Crete, May 1941. A Mediterranean island transformed overnight into a death trap. The heat pressed down like a physical weight on the rocks and scrubland of Maelime, shimmering above the airfield's scarred runway where fires still burned from the morning's bombardment. The acrid smell of aviation fuel mixed with the salt wind from the Aegean, and everywhere you looked, the twisted wreckage of aircraft and equipment told the story of a defense already crumbling. Sergeant Alfred Clive Hume, 23 years old and 6,000 miles from his New Zealand home, crouched in the shallow depression that might charitably be called a defensive position. His uniform was stained with dust and sweat, and his hands, calloused from years of farm work before the war found him, gripped a rifle that already felt inadequate for what was coming. Around him, the 22nd Battalion waited, not in the disciplined formations they had practiced in Egypt, but in scattered clusters of exhausted men whose eyes kept drifting to the sky. They had been told to expect an assault. They had been told to hold the airfield. What they had not been told, because no one truly understood it yet, was that they were about to witness something unprecedented in the history of warfare. An entire invasion force delivered not by ship or by land, but by air. An invasion that would begin with the sky itself turning against them. It started as a distant drone, barely audible over the wind. Then the drone became a roar. Then the roar became something beyond description. The transport aircraft came in waves, hundreds of them, blotting out the morning sun. Junkers 52s with their corrugated metal skin and ungainly shapes, flying so low that Hume could see the pilots' faces in the cockpits. They flew directly into the defensive fire, ignoring the tracers that reached up for them like angry fingers, ignoring the losses, flying with a mechanical determination that spoke of fanaticism or orders so absolute that death was preferable to failure. And from their bellies and sides, men began to fall. Not fall, jump, deliberately throwing themselves into the air in numbers that defied belief. The parachutes opened in their hundreds, then their thousands. White silk mushrooms blossoming against the blue sky, drifting down like deadly snow onto the airfield, into the olive groves, across the ridgelines where New Zealand and British and Greek defenders watched in stunned disbelief. For a moment, suspended between the aircraft and the earth, the German paratroopers were completely vulnerable. Hanging in their harnesses, rifles strapped to containers that would fall separately, unable to maneuver or defend themselves. It was a massacre. The defenders opened fire with everything they had, and paratroopers died in the air, their parachutes collapsing, their bodies tumbling the remaining distance to earth. But there were too many, far too many. The ones who reached the ground alive did something that Hume would remember for the rest of his life. They did not take cover. They did not retreat or regroup. They attacked immediately with nothing but pistols and grenades and a ferocity that bordered on suicidal. They charged directly at the defensive positions, screaming, dying in waves, but never stopping. Behind them, more transports arrived. More parachutes opened. More men fell. The mathematics of it were simple and terrible. The Germans were willing to accept losses that would break any conventional force, because they knew that eventually, inevitably, the sheer weight of numbers would overwhelm the defenders. Hume fired until his rifle barrel was too hot to touch. He fired until his ammunition was almost gone. Around him, men died, not from the initial assault, but from wounds that might have been survivable if there had been medical supplies, if there had been time, if there had been anything except more Germans and more fighting and more chaos. The defensive line held. Barely. The paratroopers pulled back, dragging their casualties with them, disappearing into the olive groves and the rocky hills. And in the temporary silence that followed, Hume and the survivors began to understand a truth that the generals had not yet grasped. This was not a raid or a diversionary attack. This was the main assault, and there would be no reinforcements, no air support, no evacuation. They were alone. The second day brought a different horror. The Germans did not come in waves this time. They came as ghosts, as shadows, as death from impossible distances. The first man died before anyone understood what was happening. A private from Hume's platoon, crouched behind cover that should have been safe, suddenly pitched forward with a hole in his temple. No sound of a shot, no muzzle flash, just sudden death from nowhere. Then another man, then another, not in clusters but spread across the defensive line, each death precisely placed, each one creating fear that spread like poison through the ranks. Snipers. German snipers, and not the opportunistic riflemen that every army fielded, but specialists trained at a school in Bohemia, where they learned not just marksmanship but camouflage, fieldcraft, patience, and the psychological warfare of invisible death. They wore distinctive smocks, mottled brown and green patterns that broke up the human outline. They carried scoped rifles, precision instruments that made killing at 500 yards a matter of routine, and they were very, very good at their job. They would move into position in the pre-dawn darkness, concealing themselves so thoroughly that men walked past without seeing them. Then they would wait, breathing slowly, controlling their heartbeat until the perfect shot presented itself. A soldier reaching for his canteen, an officer looking through binoculars, a medic treating the wounded. They did not waste ammunition. They did not miss, and they did not show mercy. The effect on morale was devastating. Men who had held against massed paratrooper assaults now flinched at shadows. Foxholes that had been adequate defense against machine guns became traps where you waited to die. Officers stopped moving openly. Communication between positions became sporadic, and the casualties mounted, one perfect shot at a time. Hume watched it happen, watched good men become paralyzed by fear of an enemy they could not see, watched the defensive positions that had held against impossible odds begin to crumble because no one could maintain discipline while waiting for a bullet from nowhere. And something inside him, something that might have been rage or grief or simple calculation, decided that this could not continue. The wounded man was crying, not screaming. He was too far gone for that, but making soft, pitiful sounds that carried across the open ground between the defensive line and where he had fallen. He had been trying to reach a better position when the sniper found him. The shot had broken his leg, and now he lay in the open, exposed, bleeding, and everyone knew what would happen next. The sniper would wait, would let the sounds of suffering draw out others to help, would add to his count, one bullet at a time, in a display of cruel efficiency that was also terrifyingly practical. Hume did not think about it. Thinking would have stopped him. He went over the edge of his foxhole at a run, keeping low, zigzagging in a pattern that he hoped was unpredictable. Shots cracked past him, not from the sniper, but from German positions farther down the line. But he reached the wounded man and dragged him by his webbing, pulling him backward toward cover. The sniper did not fire. Hume understood why in the moment before he heard the shot. The sniper was not aiming at him, could not track a moving target that was expecting to be shot at, was looking for the next careless exposure, the next easy kill. But now Hume knew where the sniper was. The German had given away his position with the absence of a shot, had revealed himself through patience, through following doctrine, through being exactly what he was trained to be. Hume got the wounded man back to cover, grabbed his rifle, and did something that showed either exceptional skill or suicidal confidence. He took a prone position at the edge of cover, steadied his breathing, and aimed at a spot in the olive grove 600 yards away where nothing visible suggested a target. The shot, when it came, felt perfect. The rifle's recoil, the sight picture, the squeeze of the trigger, all perfect. And 600 yards away, in the shadows beneath an olive tree where a man had been invisible in his camouflage smock, something moved, fell, stopped being a threat. Hume did not feel triumph. He felt something else entirely. He felt possibility. He crossed the open ground again, this time with purpose. The dead German sniper lay where he had fallen, his rifle still gripped in hands that would never fire it again. Hume took the rifle. It was beautiful in the way that weapons of precision are beautiful. A Mauser carabiner 98 with a scope mounted perfectly, the action smooth, every surface carefully maintained. He also took the smock. The distinctive camouflage smock that marked its wearer as a member of the 7th Air Division's elite Fallschirmjäger. He rolled up the smock and carried it back to his position along with the rifle, and did not tell anyone what he was planning. Because what he was planning would get him executed if he was caught. The Geneva Convention was specific about what a soldier could and could not wear in combat. You wore your nation's uniform. You carried your identification. You did not disguise yourself as the enemy. These were not suggestions. They were laws backed by the understanding that without them, war would descend into a chaos where no prisoner was safe, no surrender was honored, and every soldier was a potential spy to be killed on sight. Hume knew this. He also knew that the convention assumed conventional warfare between conventional armies. It did not account for a situation where his men were being systematically murdered by invisible killers. He waited until dark. Then he put on the German smock over his own uniform, took the scoped rifle, and slipped out of the defensive line. The landscape at night was alive with sounds. Distant artillery, small arms fire from skirmishes along the constantly shifting lines, the drone of aircraft overhead. Hume moved through it all like a ghost, using the terrain, using the darkness, using the confusion of a battle that had no clear front line and no clear distinction between safe and dangerous ground. The German smock made him invisible in a different way than camouflage normally worked. It made him expected. It made him belong. Any German sentry who caught a glimpse of him would see the distinctive pattern of a Fallschirmjäger smock and assume a fellow paratrooper. Any Allied soldier who spotted him would be dead before they could sound the alarm. It was the perfect disguise, and it was also a death sentence if he was captured. He found the first German sniper position by sound, the tiny rustle of fabric as a man adjusted his position, the controlled exhale of breath before taking a shot at some target Hume could not see. He approached from behind, moving with infinite patience, until he was close enough to smell the man's unwashed uniform. The killing was silent, efficient, and intimate. A blade, not a bullet. The German died without understanding what had happened, and Hume took his position, scanned for the next target through the darkness. Over the next 3 nights, he killed 11 more snipers this way, each one a carefully planned approach, each one a violent conclusion in darkness. He varied his methods, sometimes the blade, sometimes the rifle at very close range, once with his bare hands when circumstances left no other choice. He did not keep count consciously, but the number burned itself into his memory anyway. 12 men who died never knowing they had been hunted by someone wearing their own uniform. The effect on the German sniper operations was immediate and profound. Positions that had been active went silent. Snipers began calling in to their command more frequently, checking on each other because something was wrong and no one could explain what. The Germans sent out patrols to investigate. Hume avoided them or, when necessary, shot them from distances where the distinctive crack of a Mauser rifle would be interpreted as friendly fire. The confusion multiplied. The fear spread. The invisible hunters became the hunted, and they did not know how to respond. On the fourth day, Hume received word that his brother had been killed in action. Norman Hume, younger by 3 years, had died during the defense of another sector of the island. The message was brief, official, and completely inadequate to contain the reality of loss. Hume read it, folded it carefully, put it in his pocket, and went out that night to kill 3 more German snipers. He did not connect these things consciously. Did not think of the killings as revenge or tribute or anything else that would give them meaning beyond military necessity. But something in him hardened that day. Something that allowed him to do what needed to be done without the hesitation that might otherwise have come from conscience or doubt. By the end of the first week, he had killed 20 snipers. By the end of the second week, the number had climbed to 32. 32 enemy soldiers who died because one sergeant had decided that the rules of warfare were less important than protecting his men. The casualties from sniper fire in his battalion sector dropped dramatically. Men began moving more freely. Officers began believing they might survive. And no one asked questions about how this had happened, because asking questions would mean acknowledging what Hume was doing. An acknowledgement would mean either stopping him or becoming complicit in a war crime. Then came the withdrawal. The defense of Crete had failed. Everyone knew it now. The Germans controlled the airfield. Reinforcements were arriving by the hour. The Allied forces were being compressed into an ever-shrinking perimeter, and the only question was whether they could evacuate before being completely destroyed. The order came down: fall back to the southern coast. Ships would be waiting. Maybe. Hume moved with his battalion in the chaotic retreat, but he did not stop hunting. The withdrawal created opportunities. Lines of advance and retreat crossed and recrossed. German and Allied units found themselves in close proximity with no clear separation. In this confusion, a man in a German camouflage smock could move with impunity, could position himself behind enemy formations, could kill officers and radio men and machine gun crews, could create chaos that allowed his own unit to break contact and continue the retreat. He killed 7 more Germans during the withdrawal. Not snipers this time, but targets of opportunity. A lieutenant coordinating an ambush position. 2 radio men calling in artillery support. A machine gun team setting up to enfilade the retreating Allies. Each death bought time for men to escape. Each death violated every principle of lawful warfare. And each death saved lives that Hume could count in the faces of the men who made it to the evacuation beaches. He was wounded during the final engagement. A German patrol spotted him at close range, too close for the disguise to work, close enough to see that the man in the Fallschirmjäger smock had the wrong face, the wrong gear, the wrong eyes. The firefight was brief and brutal. Hume killed 3 of them with the Mauser rifle at point-blank range. A 4th got a shot into his shoulder before Hume's blade found his throat. The wound was bad, but not immediately fatal. He bound it as best he could and kept moving, because stopping meant death or capture, and capture while wearing the enemy uniform meant something worse than death. He made it to the evacuation beach as the last ships were preparing to leave. Delirious from blood loss and exhaustion, he was pulled aboard by men who did not understand why he was wearing a German smock or carrying a German rifle. He tried to explain. The words came out confused, disconnected. Someone gave him water. Someone else bandaged his shoulder properly. And then consciousness left him entirely, and he woke 3 days later in a hospital in Egypt, no longer on Crete, no longer in immediate danger, but carrying wounds that had nothing to do with the bullet hole in his shoulder. The Victoria Cross came quietly, not with the usual fanfare, not with the full citation that would normally accompany such an award. The official record mentioned extraordinary courage under fire, mentioned numerous enemy casualties, mentioned exemplary leadership during the withdrawal. It did not mention the German smock, did not mention the disguise, did not mention the 32 snipers or the 7 soldiers killed during the retreat. These details were classified, buried in reports that would remain sealed for decades, because no one in the chain of command wanted to explain how a Commonwealth soldier had been awarded the highest honor for valor, while simultaneously committing what amounted to perfidy under the laws of war. Hume received his medal from a general who shook his hand and said nothing about the methods, said nothing about the questions that had been raised, said nothing about the debate that had occurred at levels far above a sergeant's pay grade about whether this man should be court-martialed or decorated. In the end, pragmatism won. Hume had saved lives. He had disrupted enemy operations. He had shown initiative and courage. And his actions would remain classified, buried so deep that the ethical questions they raised could be safely ignored. The psychological cost was not something that could be buried. Hume survived the war, went home to New Zealand, married, had children, lived a life that from the outside appeared normal, successful, unremarkable. But those who knew him well spoke of silences that would descend without warning, spoke of nights where sleep did not come, spoke of a man who had seen something or done something that had changed him in ways that could not be undone. He spoke rarely of Crete, never spoke of the snipers. The German rifle and smock disappeared after the evacuation, either lost in the chaos or deliberately disposed of, and Hume never mentioned them again. Decades later, when researchers finally accessed the classified records and pieced together what had happened, the debate began anew. Was Hume a war criminal who had violated the most fundamental laws of armed conflict? Was he a pragmatic soldier who had adapted to an impossible situation? Was he a hero who had saved countless lives through actions that were morally questionable but militarily effective? The arguments continue to this day, in military academies and ethics courses, because Hume's actions on Crete represent something deeply uncomfortable. The recognition that warfare, for all its rules and conventions, sometimes creates situations where the right choice and the lawful choice are not the same thing. The Battle of Crete itself was a strategic disaster for the Allies. The island fell to German control. Thousands of Commonwealth soldiers were killed, captured, or evacuated under fire. The Luftwaffe's victory demonstrated that airborne assault could succeed against prepared defenses, a lesson that would influence military doctrine for decades. But the Germans paid a horrific price. Their paratrooper casualties were so severe that Hitler forbade any future large-scale airborne operations. The elite Fallschirmjäger, the same men Hume had hunted in the darkness, would never again be used in their intended role. They fought for the rest of the war as conventional infantry, their specialized training wasted, because the cost of their victory on Crete was deemed too high to repeat. Whether Hume's actions contributed to that cost is impossible to quantify. 32 snipers out of thousands of German paratroopers seems like a small number. But warfare is not just about body counts. It is about morale, about confidence, about the certainty that your specialized units can perform their specialized functions without being systematically destroyed by an enemy who should not have been able to reach them. The German sniper operations on Crete became hesitant, paranoid, less effective, and that degradation rippled through the entire tactical situation in ways that cannot be precisely measured, but were certainly real. What can be measured is simpler. The men in Hume's battalion sector experienced significantly lower casualties from sniper fire than comparable units. They maintained cohesion during the withdrawal. They reached the evacuation beaches in larger numbers. Some of them went on to fight in North Africa, Italy, and Northern Europe. Some of them returned home after the war, had families, built lives that would never have existed if a certain sergeant had not decided that his men's lives were worth more than the rules he was violating. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable, because we want our war heroes to be uncomplicated. We want them to embody clear moral principles, to show us that courage and honor and righteousness can triumph in the darkest circumstances. Hume's story does not allow that comfort. He saved lives by taking lives in ways that violated the most fundamental conventions of warfare. He protected his men by becoming, effectively, a war criminal. He earned the Victoria Cross while doing things that should have earned him a firing squad. And the fact that military authorities quietly classified his methods, rather than prosecuting him, suggests that they understood something that we are still reluctant to acknowledge. Sometimes the right thing and the legal thing exist in different universes, and the men who cross that gap carry the cost for the rest of their lives. Sergeant Alfred Clive Hume died in 1976 at the age of 58. The official cause was heart failure. Those who knew him wondered if it was something else. If carrying the weight of 32 lives taken in the darkness, of decisions made in desperation, of honors received for actions that should never have been honored, had a cost that could not be measured in medical terms. His Victoria Cross sits now in a military museum, polished and displayed, a symbol of extraordinary valor. The German rifle and smock are long gone, either destroyed or lost to history, perhaps deliberately, because some artifacts carry meanings too complex to preserve. The lesson, if there is one, is not about tactics or training or the effectiveness of irregular warfare. The lesson is about what we ask of soldiers when we send them into situations where all the choices are bad and someone still has to choose. We tell them to obey the laws of war. We tell them to show courage. We tell them to protect their comrades. And when those imperatives collide, when the only way to protect your men requires breaking the rules that keep warfare from descending into absolute barbarism, we create men like Hume, men who do what is necessary and carry the consequences in silence, men who receive medals and condemnation in equal measure, depending on who is telling the story and what they choose to emphasize. The question that remains, the question that has no comfortable answer, is this. If you were there in that moment, watching your men die one by one from invisible killers you could not fight by the rules, what would you have done? Would you have maintained your moral purity and let them die? Would you have crossed the line Hume crossed and lived with the consequences? Would you have found some third option that the historical record does not show? These are not hypothetical questions. They are the questions that define what it means to have command responsibility, to have moral agency, to have the terrible privilege of choice in circumstances where every choice has a cost measured in lives and souls. 32 snipers, 1 sergeant, a story that should be simple but refuses to be because the most important stories never are. If you found this story as disturbing and thought-provoking as I hope it is, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like on the video. More importantly, I want to know what you think. Was Hume a war criminal who violated the fundamental laws of armed conflict? Or was he a soldier who made an impossible choice in an impossible situation? Was what he did morally defensible, even if it was legally indefensible? Leave your thoughts in the comments. There are no easy answers here, and I am genuinely curious where you stand on this question. Because ultimately, this is not just a story about one man on one island in 1941. It is a story about what we are willing to sacrifice, what rules we are willing to break, and what we are willing to become when the alternative is watching good people die for the sake of principles that the enemy does not share.